We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to come with us and talk about these 3 actions that will help to raise ELA student achievement. So the slide that you're looking at right now, this information, as you recall, when the new college and career standards came out several years ago, they're not new anymore, we all were introduced to these shifts, right? The instructional shifts that go with the standards. And I remember myself, I was in a district when these came out. We learned about these, but I remember asking myself so many times, what does this look like? What does it look like in practice? Like it's easy to understand what all these things mean and how they're supposed to be used, but we didn't really understand what it was supposed to look like in classrooms. And as we started working with districts around these 3 core actions, we started looking at, okay, so what did the standards before really focus on? And the standards started by focusing on, before we had college and career standards, it was mainly focused on skill-based instruction and on strategy instruction. So we spent a lot of time in the classrooms teaching our students strategies for reading, but not really getting into analyzing text and getting into deep meaning of text. And these were some of the behaviors that we saw before. We'd spent a lot of time making text to self connections. When the new standards came out, the ELA standards came out, that's when the shifts came in. And so we were supposed to begin to start focusing on complexity, focus on evidence, focusing on knowledge. And again, not really understanding that the intent behind the standards and understanding the architecture that was meant behind the standards. Many of us didn't realize that our goal was to transform how we taught literacy. So many of us kept our same routines and approaches and added the standards and thought we had made the appropriate shifts. We're implementing the new standards. We know the standards. We've deconstructed the standards, unwrapped the standards. So we're good to go. And as we're working with districts, so many across the nation, we believe that if we're implementing the standards, that we are aligned. But in actuality, we needed to update the approaches. So we put our instruction into our current routines, into the current structures that we had for instruction. And we didn't really do the update that we were supposed to. And I'm going to tell you, I didn't know any better either. It's only after many years of learning and really delving deep, and I will tell you with a partnership with Student Achievement Partners, where we really started to understand what this meant for implementation. So as we began working with districts across the nation, we go in and we do a curriculum diagnostic. So we wanted to see, we've gone into high functioning districts, we've gone into districts who are struggling. What are we seeing in classrooms? So these 3 actions that we're going to talk about today, you can get a little preview with what you see on the screen right now. But as we went into these classrooms and we started looking for what kind of evidences do we see these behaviors and teacher and student behaviors in classroom, and we found that these 3 core actions are almost non-existent. And the data that you're looking at now, the first column to your left is representing core action 1, the middle one is core action 2, and that third column is core action 3, which we're going to talk about today, what these core actions are. So what we noticed is that these were almost, like I said, non-existent in classrooms. And this data is representing hundreds of classrooms, many districts across the nation. So we knew there was an issue. So we really see this as the current state. And many districts, really struggle with, okay, so what does this look like? And what I'm going to talk to you today about these 3 core actions, once we've worked with districts and we've helped them understand what the core actions are and how that looks, how we implement that in the classroom, we see immediate results in the classroom. So you can see we do that curriculum diagnostic, the first one, very low after just 1 cycle. We're talking a couple of months. Teachers really are hungry for this learning. They really want to understand what it means and what it looks like, because we're still struggling with college and career standards today after being out for almost 10 years now. So where are these core actions coming from? They come from the instructional practice guide. Some of you may be familiar with that. It's organized around 3 core actions, which the shifts are integrated into these core actions. And what you'll find is that the core actions consist of teacher and student behaviors that exemplify, and really it's what these standards should look like in classrooms. The tool is awesome. You can use it for planning, reflection, and collaboration, and also for coaching. So it's a very powerful tool that we actually provide you on the day that if you would like to engage with us in learning about these core actions. So we're going to start today with core action 1. And what I want you to do, we're going to start by doing an audience poll. We're going to do a couple of these that Eric mentioned before. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to conduct the audience poll for us.
Okay, so here's our first poll, and it's a simple yes or no question. So do a little reflection. I'll read it a couple of times for you. Have grade level anchor texts been determined for every unit? Have grade level anchor texts, which include qualitative, quantitative, reader, and task considerations, been determined for every unit? So give that some consideration. Give it a yes or a no. Hopefully it won't let you do both. And we'll close it down here in a second. Okay. So the results, about 50-50 or so. We got about 43% say yes, and 57% said no. Carla?
Right, and yeah, that is actually pretty typical of what we're seeing in the field. So yay, we are looking about, like, there is some work that has begun in this area, but you notice that the qualifier I put here, because sometimes a resource may say to us this is an anchor text, or we may deem it an anchor text, but in order for it to be an anchor text, we must have taken it through the analysis for the qualitative, quantitative, and reader task considerations in order to determine if it's actually grade level complex text. So let's take a look at core action 1. So core action 1 is really just stating that we're supposed to focus each lesson on a high quality text. Now, what you see below are 3 indicators for what that looks like. Now, some of you may be saying, well, duh, Carla, I mean, it's ELA instruction. Of course, every lesson is going to be focused on high quality text. Surprisingly enough, whenever we remember that data that I showed you in one of our first slides, where it's almost non-existent, you would be surprised to see how often when we're going into ELA classrooms, we do not see students in text. We see a lot of skills practice. We see a lot of things happening in the classroom, but we're not seeing students engaged into text. So what we're looking for, and as you can see the indicators, a majority of the lesson is spent listening to, reading, writing, or speaking about text. So basically, when we go into an ELA classroom, we want to see kids in text. We want to see text everywhere. It's kind of like if you're going to dinner, the main thing you want to see is the food, right? If there's no food at the table, you're not really having dinner. If you're not engaging in text, you're really not doing this, and as far as what the standards are really calling for. And then you'll notice that second indicator, the anchor text, are at or above the complexity level expected for the grade and time in the school year. And there's a lot of complexity to this, actually, when we start talking about what this looks like in implementation, but we're going to go back to the majority of the lesson, right? How much time are we seeing kids in those complex texts? Now in K2, I just want to make this as an outlier, an exception to this. A lot of this is read aloud, but for the read alouds that teachers are doing with their students, we want to see that at least 2 grade levels above the grade level. So kindergarten would be reading second level, 3rd grade level text at that time, because they're doing read alouds with that. The text exhibit exceptional craft and thought, and they provide meaningful information. And I really want you to notice the second part of this, in service of building knowledge. So you'll recognize that term from the shifts, right? It's all about complex text, asking the right questions, and then building knowledge. So as I told you in the beginning, you're going to see the shifts are embedded in here. They're integrated throughout each one of these indicators. So I'll try to highlight that and bring that to you so that you can connect to that. So I want you to look at these indicators and think about the types of text that you see in your classrooms, because I know we have leaders on today. We also have some classroom teachers. So as a teacher, think about what the text that you're using in your classroom. Could I come in your classroom today and would I see these indicators being observed in your classroom? As a leader, think about the classrooms that you're walking on a daily basis. And I'm going to gonna just be a little controversial here and say that I don't think that when you read these indicators and look at the indicators, it doesn't sound like test prep or practice worksheets. This is really getting into that real type of anchor text that's going to help build the knowledge for our students. So as we continue, again, it begins with text complexity. And as I stated earlier, it's about looking at these three dimensions as we're looking at the text complexity. So when we think about the quantitative measures, this is looking at the readability, and usually this is measured by computer programs. So there's a lot of websites, lexile.com, you can go to and put in your text and it'll tell you what the quantitative. And so oftentimes in districts that we've worked with, they've done the quantitative measures, but then they stopped. So we encourage, and in the work that we're doing with districts, we want to remind them that it's really important that you finish the analysis and that you do the qualitative and the reader task considerations. Now, qualitative measures are really looking at the levels of meaning and purpose, text structure, language features, and knowledge demands. This is critical for using these type of texts in the classroom. So one of the biggest complaints that I hear, I wouldn't say complaint, I would say struggle. The struggle out there is, Carla, I get you. I understand that we need to have all of our students in grade level text, but our kids can't read it. Well, there's a lot of strategies that we can use to help all of our students get into these texts. And the qualitative features are the key. Once we understand what the qualitative features of the text are, that's going to drive our planning. It's going to drive our questioning that we do in the classroom. And here's the real benefit of it. It helps us understand what makes the text complex for our students. Between doing that analysis and the reader and task considerations, it really does help us understand even the outside factors that might help us understand the difficulty in reading the text for our students. Then that helps us understand what supports we need to provide. So when we think about the reader and task considerations, we're thinking about what might make this difficult for my students. So I'm considering individual students and the task that I have in mind before I make the final decision about how to use this text, or even if I should use this text. And I can tell you, after working with lots of teachers, and once they understand what this process looks like, I've seen teachers check off, yep, it meets the quantitative, yes, it meets the qualitative, but then when they get to reader and task considerations, they find out this is just not rich enough. It's really difficult for me to think about the types of tasks with this piece of text for my students. So because they have to start considering, will my students be interested in the topic or subject of this text? Now, we all know that we can't completely depend on that, right? But we do need to consider it, because if it's not of interest to our students, how can I help them become interested in this topic of the book so that they will engage in it? Again, that's some of my considerations. Is the content appropriate for the age of my students? Sometimes a text will be quantitative and qualitative, but the topic itself is just not appropriate for the grade level of students that I'm working with. And of course, I love the third consideration here is there potential for good conversation among readers? Because sometimes it's not, and that may be the one reason that I decide to not use a text. So the rich conversation for this is just incredible. And I just want to say, this is not a task that you want teachers doing in isolation. It's not a solo act. This is very beneficial and helpful to do in grade teams, in PLCs. This is the work that we want to see teachers engaging in. Again, for the purpose of understanding what really makes this text complex so that I understand how that's going to drive my instruction. So I just said that, text complexity is really the beginning. It's also the bottom line, because what we have to understand is that there is no evidence that struggling students, struggling readers catch up by reading from simpler text. And of course, this is Tim Shanahan, one of my favorite people to read about ELA and reading. And, so sometimes we just have to think about, yes, we do need just right text when they're reading independent. We do want them being able to read independently what they can read. But just think about the time of day that that's happening. The rest of the time, we really want our students engaging in those complex texts. I mean, we talk, right now in education, we're talking constantly about equity and access. If we're not providing the rich text with rich content to all of our students, there's our learning gap right there with reading. There's our reading gap. This is why we see so many third grade gaps, because we're allowing students to read only on their grade level text and not engaging in the more complex texts that are should be available to all students. So for core action 1, what are the key questions as a leader or as a teacher that you might want to ask yourself? Curriculum, is part of this work already done? And if it's done, is it accurate? One of the things that we do with schools is we're constantly checking the work that's been done, because we've learned so much more and have so much more understanding today than we did several years ago when some of the work started. So we want to make sure that sometimes in resources that are provided, because there's a sticker on the front that says it's all at grade level complex text, you still want to check it. And it's a good process, again, for the teachers to go through to be able to identify and understand what makes the text complex. Why is this text grade level complex text? And of course, checking for that accuracy. And then, of course, what I said earlier, it's about collaboration. For teachers to do this in isolation, it just takes so much time and it's such a heavy lift. But within PLCs and within coaching structures, this can be some very valid work for people as they're implementing complex text. Then the reader task, what structures and supports can we use to give all students access to complex text? So really, when we think about the knowledge, really, what will we need to do to support readers' understanding? How will you teach it? Asking those kind of questions for that collaboration pieces will be very beneficial to you. And then that reader and task, just how are you going to provide students to all students? And these are some really pivotal strategies that require some talking through at your school. What do you have available? How do we provide structures in the classroom if students can't read the text? Can we put them together in teams so that they're reading together as a team and they're still having that opportunity to engage into the text? And it's amazing what we've seen teachers do as we've worked with teachers to do this. We hear this phrase all the time: I had no idea what my kids could do unless they were given that. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go through today. One of the questions, I always get a little concerned when we talk about complex text and understanding that. We walk into classrooms. I personally walk in classrooms a lot across the nation, and sometimes I see text in the classroom that does not appear to be on grade level, very simple text, not a rich quality piece of text. But the question that we want to ask teachers is not to be judgmental or evaluative, because there could be a reason behind it. Why was this text selected for today's lesson is really the question to ask. And teachers, ask that of yourself. Why am I selecting this text? What is the purpose of this today? What am I hoping that my students are going to learn from this? What knowledge am I going to build based on the text that we've chosen today? And is it one of a sequence of text that you're going to be using to build that knowledge? And, so we want to build text sets with that nice range of on level, below level, and above level text so that students are really building knowledge. And again, we're going to talk more about building knowledge as we get into core actions 2 and 3. So those are our key questions to ask around core action 1. Now we're going to delve into core action 2, and we're going to go through these, pretty quickly today because of our time. But we wanted to give you just a very high level view of what these core actions are and what they look like in the classroom. Core action 2, Eric, it's time for another audience poll. I'm going to turn it back to you to do our second poll today.
Okay. All right, here we go. Question is, what type of questions do you see or use most often within your classroom, school, or district? And so we're asking you to select one. Personal reactions to text, text-dependent, memory, text-specific, or life experiences. So give this some thought. I'll give you a few more seconds since we have about 5 options there. And we still have a few more responses coming in, Carla.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'm going to close it down. And let's see what the results look like. All right. So it looks like about 40%, 41% of you indicated text dependent. And following that, at about 30% was text specific. And then about 15% personal reactions to text, then memory at about 11%, and life experiences about 4%.
Okay. Well, that's a nice range. Of course, text dependent, text specific. All right, we're going to have some great conversation around this now. So when we look at core action 2, and of course I apologize for so much text on the screen, and guess what, core action 3 is going to be even worse. So, but we did want you to see within the context of what the core action was and those classroom indicators that go with it. So one of the things that we notice about this is that teachers are employing questions and tasks, both oral and written, that are text specific, and they're accurately addressing the analytical thinking required by the grade level standards. So, that's the core action. That's the overarching piece of what we look for in core action 2. It's all about questions and tasks. Ask and task is one of the things that we talk about a lot in our work. So, a lot of people say, okay, text dependent, text specific, what's the difference? Well, that's what we're going to get into today, because technically, by definition, they are different. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those differences are and the similarities in them. So what we're looking for here in core action 2 is that the questions themselves are going to attend to those qualitative features. So remember, when we were talking about text complexity, we talked about how those qualitative features are about meaning, purpose, language, structure, and the knowledge demands. These are those considerations for qualitative features. So what we want to do is we want to use that work that we did in determining what makes the text complex to create questions, so that we can ask very meaningful, purposeful questions, and as we're using the text that we're using. So we also want to look for questions that are requiring students to use evidence from the text. So one of the trick questions that was on the poll was from memory. So it's a common, I think, misrepresentation of this indicator when we walk into classrooms. So teachers will ask a really good question. It's a text specific or text dependent question, but yet they don't require students to actually go into the text and to look for that. Remember, this purpose is to get students to engage in that text and reread the text as much as they can. So when they go into the text, or when we ask these very good questions, we want students to go in the text and show me, prove it to me that this was in the text. Where did you find that in the text? So that they're going back and they're reading again. We love to see this done with teams so that they're talking about it, they're agreeing and disagreeing with what they're coming up with as they're answering these great, rich questions that we're asking. Of course, we're looking for those questions and tasks that are going to actually attend to that rich vocabulary that they're encountering in the text, especially when they're encountering information text, because sometimes they're learning a whole concept around the academic vocabulary that's in the text. And then finally, the questions or tasks can sequence to build knowledge. So we can start with more of the text dependent and then build to the text specific, so that we organize and scaffold the questions so that all students have access to those questions. So let's talk about why evidence. I mean, why such a focus on evidence? I mean, the standards really require it. Life requires it. And of course, research confirms the power of it. When we think about the standards, if we look at in the reading standards, key ideas and details, it talks about to determine what the text says explicitly and to make logical inferences from it, to cite specific textual evidence. In writing, we hear terms like to research to build and present knowledge, draw evidence from literary or informational texts to support analysis, reflection, and research. And then, of course, in speaking and listening, we hear more there about the use of evidence. So when students are talking, when we go into the classroom and students are talking, we want to hear that talking about text, and we want to hear them using that evidence to support the productive struggle that they're having within those groups. And of course, life requires it. I wish in the workplace, and I know probably some of my coworkers are listening, I wish I could tell them to do things because I said so. But that might work at home, but it usually doesn't work in the workplace. We have to cite evidence. We have to talk about the why behind it. And the same thing happens. We want, in the college and career standards, we really wanted students to become critical thinkers and to think about why we're giving the claims that we're giving in the classroom. And of course, that ability to cite evidence, it really differentiates strong from weak performances on our assessments as well. So we want to certainly, stress that too in the classroom, that students are backing up everything they say with evidence that they're getting from text. A lot of times we use a term, sometimes we just MSU things where students, and we ourselves maybe, and I'm not talking about Mississippi State University here, I'm talking about making stuff up. We can hear something, have an interpretation of something, and it really isn't getting to the root cause or the deep analysis that we want students to get to, which is why we want to require the evidence. Now, there's a lot of studies out there of research that is confirming why we want to do this. One of the most the ones that cited the most in the standards is the McEwen, Beck, and Blake, which was really about rethinking comprehension instruction. They compared content instruction versus strategy instruction versus control approach, which was where lessons were developed using questions available in the teacher's edition of a Basel. And of course, they found that content instruction, which is where students are focused on student attention on the content of the text through open, meaning-based questions about the text, was the one that had the highest impact on students. So let's talk now, let's get to this text dependent and text specific. So when we think about text dependent, I'm going to start off by showing you some examples. So what is the author's message in the text? It is text dependent because it's requiring the students to answer that question from a text. But the difference is it's kind of a canned question. I could ask that question of a lot of different texts. And so therefore, a lot of times these types of questions do not require students to go into the depth of the text that we want them to do. So let's look at what that type of question might look like if it were text specific. From a piece of text, why does Monk ask this question? Which we the people has troubled the nation? So the student has to go into the text, find that part, and really reread that area in order to answer that question. So these are the types of questions we want to see. Remember that indicator. The majority of the lesson is around these types of questions. You still want to see some text dependent, excuse me, but we want to mainly see the text specific. So here's another example. What is the main idea of the passage? So you understand now another example of one that's kind of the canned type of question that you could ask of almost any text. And these are okay to use, but again, and they certainly come from the standards. It's got standards language in it. what we want to do is see the type of questions that is asking about the main idea. So I'm not asking what's the main idea, but if you look at this question, why does Monk claim that popular sovereignty is the form of government in America? In order to answer that question, I have to understand what the main idea of the story is. If not, I'm going to miss that question. So it's really getting to those features that we talked about before in going through what makes the text complex. So what details can you find that support the main idea? Again, I can ask that out of a lot of text out there, but what does it look like? What evidence is there in paragraph 3 regarding Marshall's claim about the evolving nature of the Constitution? Again, I have to know the details, the key details of the text in order to find that support of the main idea, but the word main idea or details is nowhere in that question. But I'm going to have to be able to locate those things in order to answer the question. Now, you know, one of the benefits, the biggest benefits of this, let me show you one more example. So here's Mr. Popper's Penguins, a very popular text that a lot of us may have read. I know I read it in school. So you can see the example at the top where there's name, you know, character traits, the character, you draw a picture of the character. You know, it's asking the students to identify character traits for Mr. Popper. This is text dependent, and it draws on the standards. The literature standard, describe character settings and major events in a story using key details. It absolutely is asking, and it's aligned to the standard. Task B, the culminating task, which is asking a question, asking them to use the evidence. It's a text-specific question that pushes them deeper into their understanding of the text. And that's really what we're looking for, are those types of questions. So when we look at text-specific, it's questions that can only be answered by reading that text. So I could only answer the Mr. Popper question, the culminating task, if I had read Mr. Popper and by having that book. So non-text, if you see a non-text dependent, it can be answered without a text. I probably know something about the Declaration of Sentiments, but I could possibly answer that. Describe a time that you had a grievance with someone. This one, excuse me, this question is actually, you know, asking my opinion about something. It's not really requiring me to go into the text. Text dependent, what is the author's message? You know, again, it's a text dependent. So let's think about, if you think about a rectangle and a square, all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. In the same way, text specific questions are text dependent, but not all text dependent questions are text specific. That's kind of confusing. I know, but once you practice this and teachers really get the hang of it, they get very good at doing this within their planning. And you can see on our text dependent and text specific in the sentence in lines 23 to 26, which is specific, it's requiring me to go to that. Who is being referred to as them and their? I could probably ask that out of a lot of text, but it is sending me to a specific part of the question. So key questions to ask around core action 2 that we want to think about. We want to probe the specifics of the text, and we want to try to avoid as many canned questions as we can. So the questions when you go into a classroom that you want to look for, and teachers as you're planning, these are the questions you want to ask yourself. Do these questions require evidence? Does it ask students to dig deep? Does it leverage vocabulary? And we know how we talked about those scaffolding questions. Is it building to a bigger idea? All about building knowledge. Is it building to a bigger concept? And is there a balance of reading, writing, speaking, and listening? We want to make sure that we include and we have a balance of questions as we're asking questions about the text. So the last core action we're going to talk about today is core action 3. And I told you there was going to be more on the screen for this one, but I want you to notice something really critical about core action 3. This is equity and access, which is how it's the architecture of the standards. It's what the standards were founded on, and providing and really closing the gap for reading across the nation. And one of the things that you'll see, provide all students with opportunities to engage in the work of the lesson. So if you look on the left side, These are the actions that teachers do, the behaviors that teachers should be doing. And as a result, if teachers do this, then students should be doing the all those behaviors on the right-hand side. So you can see it starts with students, and it's talking about that students are the ones who are persevering through difficulty, that they're doing the majority of the work of the lesson, that students are talking and asking questions. You know, a lot of times we'll see the teacher, you know, asking the questions, probing students, but we want to see students doing that work as they're going through this. So I'm sure you recall we showed this slide at the beginning of our time together today of the webinar. Now I want you to go back and think about this in terms of these core actions, and thinking about this. So access for all students is really what core action 3 is about, ensuring that all students are engaged in the lesson, ensuring that all students are engaged in high quality text. So remember how I said it all starts with high quality text and those complex texts. So we start by, in our planning and beginning of every lesson, as we're planning, making sure that that lesson is centered around that high quality complex text grade level. Then we want, once we have that all figured out and we make sure that we verify that it's of the right quality, then we're going to ask those questions. We're going to give the task and questions to students. We're going to hear students talk about those tasks. Not, you know, we want to have them write about those answers. We want to hear them talking about it. All of this happening around evidence-based discussion and writing. And then finally, we want to make sure that they're building that knowledge through this process of asking the questions, that we're choosing texts that are going to help students build knowledge, and that there's a volume of that happening in the classroom, that students are rich into text. And, you know, I think about in ELA, we really want to, you know, ensure that students are into the text, and that these are the indicators that are the most important that we see in our classrooms. So when we go into classrooms, there's a lot to look for, you know, and you can become overwhelmed doing classroom walkthroughs, looking in classrooms, and even peer-to-peer, you know, not just administrators, but teachers, as you're going into each other's classrooms, as you reflect on a daily basis on, you know, I know when I was in the classroom, every day I would think about what I could have done differently, what would have got more students to accomplish my targets and goals for the day. So when we think about these indicators and these 3 core actions, if we don't see anything else, these are the most important indicators. And if we can get all of our students engaged in these indicators and teachers engaged in these indicators, it will have an impact on your student achievement. It will raise that student achievement. You know, this is a quote from Dylan Williams. We have the Dylan Williams Center here, and I've heard Dylan say this so many times when we think about our students, because one of the behaviors we go into a lot of classrooms that we see some students, you know, our students who have the ability are engaging in grade level text or above grade level text. And then our struggling students are in very low level text that's not building a lot of knowledge. And as a result of that, we're seeing that learning gap happen. And we know that if we're not putting all students into that grade level text, we're seeing our struggling students continue to struggle, and we don't see that gap close as a result of that. And of course, I don't know, you know, if you're not familiar with the baseball study, I recommend that you can Google that. It'll come up. There's a lot of research out there around this. It was in, you know, the research around the college and career standards. But basically, the baseball study tells us that knowledge of a topic had a much bigger impact on comprehension than generalized reading ability did. And what this study showed was that low ability students performed very similar to high ability students, and the difference in their performance was not statistically significant. So really the big implication for student scaffolds is that students build their knowledge. So low readers can perform at high levels if they have the right knowledge, which is why we want to spend so much time and effort on building knowledge with our students. So Knowledge Matters came out with some research where the knowledge takes time. And this is why we want to give students year after year more and more knowledge, and that does build over time. So one of the things that we look for, this research shows us, and you can see for grades K to 3, the very limited amount of time that students are getting with science and social studies, which is the content that we want to see them learning. So then when they get into middle school, where they're making that real flip from learning to read and reading to learn, the students haven't encountered informational text about science or social studies, and the struggle really begins there. We see such a drop-off in our ELA scores when students are having to make that flip. We want to start in kindergarten building that knowledge, so that as we build knowledge over time, when they get to middle school, when they get to those secondary, even before then, the students have so much background knowledge. We've learned already, we cannot depend on our parents, and the home life that students have to build all this for them. We have to take that responsibility and help to build the knowledge for our students. So the time that we have, we really want to integrate that science and social studies into our reading and language arts, so that our students are encountering and learning, and we're giving them supports and teaching them how to read based on the knowledge that we're building. So, one of the things that we think about on the implications of this is that a student doesn't have one level, and each student has many levels. So, somebody who's reading at a level J in the classroom, the research is pretty much in direct opposition to current instructional practices, where we identify a reader by a level. If you're a level J and you read only level J books, but perhaps when you get to science passages, you have a lot of understanding and a lot of knowledge around that. You could read a level T based on science books, because it's a student who's very interested in science. By letting those students read only level J text, we deny them access to more complex texts that they could access and learn from a topic on which they have knowledge. And I saw this meme recently, I think it was on Twitter, that it said, nobody ever fell in love with a book by checking its level. And when you talk to teachers, they're very passionate about reading and about literacy, and they want their students to fall in love with reading and to be readers. And so we have to have these things in mind, of letting our students allow them to read books around interesting topics, because what really happens is the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. So when we think about some of our current practices in reading, are we helping all students get better at reading? Or are we helping our good readers continue giving them the great complex text, the engaging text, but our poor readers are reading those lower level texts that are not interesting, that are, doesn't build knowledge for them, and is really supported by the teacher? We see that over scaffolding with those, while, students who are able to read on their own, have great autonomy in the classroom and are reading, and so they just get better and better, and our strugglers do not close that gap for us. So what are the key questions to ask? What knowledge or skills should students demonstrate after reading a text? I mean, this is, teachers, as you're planning, ask yourself, what is the purpose of my students? And I noticed knowledge is first. What knowledge are they going to gain from reading this text? What skills are they going to get from reading this text? And then which aspects of the text are going to pose the most challenge to my students? And then how do I support them? How do I, what am I going to need to do for my students to support their understanding? And how am I going to teach this to them? How am I going to help them understand this text? And then finally, how can we provide all students access to high quality grade level text? That is the question, right? That's the tough question that takes some time for us to think about. We'd love to be able to share that with you in the work that we're doing with schools and districts. So if you have questions on that, we'd love to hear from you. I want to end today with a couple quotes. One is, you know, this quote from Richard Elmore, you know, we need, so many teachers have not had this training. One of our problems of practice is what you've heard today. Some of you may know this. It's been introduced to many district level folks. So we have a centralized knowledge at the district, or maybe some leadership in the district, but we haven't shared it with teachers. We need to increase the level of knowledge and skill that a teacher brings to this process. We need to invest in our teachers, provide them some training so that they understand what they need to do. We also need to increase the level and complexity of the content, which means the level of text that we're reading. We need to increase that complexity. And finally, we need to change the role of the student in our instructional process, which, if you heard all these indicators that we've been talking about today, that shift from teacher leading and directing everything to students being the ones to really gain in their knowledge and having that productive struggle. So one of the things I want to ask you today is, now that you know better, what are you going to do? Can you do better? You know, this is such a passionate topic for me, being out in the field and seeing still so many, you know, traditional practices in reading, and there's so many articles out there that's telling us what we need to do. You know, Emily Hanford has come out with some, you know, fantastic articles. Why are we still teaching reading the wrong way? Why aren't kids being taught to read? You know, I think it was Willingham who just came out with an article on the reading wars, where, you know, there's so much debate going on right now, but the research is pretty clear, and we've seen such success with students when they've been given this type of support. The RAND Corporation came out with a study connecting what teachers know about state ELA standards for reading and what they do in their classrooms. A big disconnect between those two things. You know, one of the things that we see constantly is that we are very good, and we've spent a lot of time in understanding our standards, but we have not done a very good job or effective job of getting these core actions into our classroom. And these are the things that we should be focusing on in order to raise student achievement. So if you're finding yourself in your classroom or in your district where you feel like, okay, we got to do something different because we're working really hard, but we're not seeing the, you know, the fruits of our labor, then maybe you want to think about really focusing on these 3 core actions to implement those in every classroom across your district. So Eric, that concludes my part today.
Great. Thank you, Carla. All right, we'd like to take some time to hear your questions and comments about today's webinar. You can submit your questions using the Go to Webinar question pane located on your screen. We've got a few of them coming in already. I'm going to ask you the first question here. What is the best way to ensure text is grade level appropriate?
Well, that would be by going through our process of determining qualitative. You know, you want to start with that, quantitative. So understanding what does a computer say is the readability for that text, and then really looking at the qualitative features, and then finally those reader and task considerations. I mean, it really takes all 3 of those to determine if it's grade level appropriate. You know, like I mentioned earlier, stopping at just getting the number, the Lexile level, you really haven't done due diligence in making that determination for your students.
Okay, that makes sense. How many standards on average should be covered in each lesson?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that we know is the standards and the architecture of the standards really do require that we integrate the standards. So most of the time, unless it's a really big standard, we like to see that integration, and it makes it very easy to integrate the standards once you understand that architecture. So when you think about asking a question, you don't have to ask a question of a single standard. Oftentimes, one question or one task can actually elicit evidence from students on several standards in just one task. So we do want to integrate those standards. There's not a magic number for this. It really is about what's appropriate. So in elementary, we like to see the integration of that informational knowledge coming through, especially in the elementary grades. So we would want to see even a science possibly or social studies standards that we're going to be monitoring and doing that formative assessment to see if our students are getting those bigger concepts.
Okay. What, well, let's see here. I got a couple more questions. Can you give more advice on developing text sets, and what are important aspects of a rigorous text set?
Ooh, that's so rigor would mean that you have you would look to see that grade level text in there. But the beauty of a text set, which is one of the supports that you can do for all students in your classroom, by building text sets, we're building the text set around a single topic. And we work with a lot of districts and supporting them in building these text sets, helping them understand what it's about. But in the text set, we're looking for a range of text, a sequence of text. So like at the beginning of a unit, when students are just learning about a topic, the topic of the text set, you know, students may be reading lower level text, but over the course on the sequence of that unit, we see students, because they're building knowledge around that topic, we see them within a unit go up in their levels as they're going through the unit, which is a fantastic thing because we don't have to wait till the end of the year to see students progress in their readability of text. We see them growing within a single unit. So over time, as they build more and more knowledge, we see more and more interaction into higher level text.
That makes sense. Okay, last question, I believe. What are some strategies to quickly tap and determine background knowledge to help students interact with complex text and build new knowledge?
Well, that's a great question. We've got a lot of good questions today, Eric. No dumb ones today. I'm kidding. There's never any dumb questions, right? So that is a really good question. May take me longer than time we have, but one of the best things I'm going to tell you that we see is by reading text. So we want students to get their background knowledge from the text instead of the teacher. So we want the text to become the expert instead of the teacher sharing all the expert. Now, how does that happen? In lower grades, it's probably going to happen with read alouds, but there's other ways that you can build the knowledge through PowerPoints, through videos, through experiments. You know, if it's science, have the students do a science inquiry project in order to build that background knowledge and then prove their claims in the text. So, you know, we a lot of times will allow students to offer claims, and then we kind of tell them they're right or wrong and tell them why. But why not let the students go into the text and prove their claim instead of you verifying their claim? It's a great way to build that background knowledge is by letting the text do it and the text set. So, okay, I didn't exactly say this when I was explaining the text set. A text set is more than text. It can be videos, it can be you know, video clips, it can be articles. In secondary, the topics that we're studying are oftentimes about literature. That is our content area in secondary. So I may be reading, you know, a fictional text, you know, piece of literature, classic literature, and there's things in the text that is talking about, you know, culture and dresses and different things from, you know, the 18th century, 17th century. And so I'm going to pull out articles, informational articles to support my students understanding that text, the literary text. So there's and you know, I can pick all different levels of readability there. I may have them watch a little snippet of a video to understand that. But again, it's snippets for the purpose of building the background knowledge, not for teaching the text, but for providing that background knowledge. I hope that helps. And with the question that you asked.
Wow, good question, got a good answer. Thanks, Carla. Okay, we're going to move on. That was the final question. Just a few closing comments. The strategies Carla outlined today are part of LSI's Innovative Professional Development Series that focuses on creating standards-driven units. Carla and her team at LSI have developed these training days, which are listed here on the screen, to help districts across the country align, develop, and implement standards-driven curriculum. Each of these training opportunities are ideal for curriculum staff, for coaches, for teachers. And to learn more about these professional development opportunities, you can visit our site, which is learningsciences.com/curriculum. That is it, and thank you so much. Have a great week.